Welcome to the Tools for Traders training session. This is February 9th, 2024. Tonight we're going to be going over the session tool. Take it, Ripper.
Thank you. This is the last tool in the package, the Tools for Traders package, that we'll be talking about. And again, this is the session tool. So let's start out by talking about exactly what is a session. Well, simply put, a session is nothing more than a period of time during the trading day. And all of the candles that close during that time period that we have defined as a session are considered to be a part of that session. Now, a session may not exceed 24 hours in length. And a session can span calendar days. So, for instance, if you trade futures, you have the Globex session. If you're on exchange time, I believe the Globex session starts at, was it 5 p.m.? So I think that's Chicago time. And then it goes through to the following day at 4 p.m. So it spans a calendar day. It's not quite 24 hours in length. Well, actually, I just gave you the entire trading session for futures. The Globex section would actually end the next morning when the regular trading hours started. So that would be 8:30 Chicago time. So a session is really nothing more, than a period of time that you have defined, and its meaning is entirely up to you, the user. So if you're an oil trader, let's say, there is a pit session for oil. And if you wanted that to show up on your charts, you could use the session tool and define a session that matches the hours of the oil pit session. And then the session tool would show that to you on your chart, and you could tell that trading was taking place in the pit session, as well as, whatever other markets may be open at that time. Because I do believe the pit session for oil does overlap at the end of the London session and also the beginning of the U.S. session and a part of the U.S. regular trading hour session. So if you were interested in seeing that on your charts, you could use the session tool to show it to you. In fact, if you wanted to, for oil, you could go and put multiple copies of the session tool onto the one chart, have one of them showing you the hours of the London session, another showing you the oil pit session, and a third one showing you the U.S. session. And you could see where those all overlap, because that may well be a time when you could get your most, the maximum activity. So that's just a, perhaps a bit of an extreme example, but it gives you an idea of what you can do. Other things you could do is if you wanted to draw a breakout box. A lot of people like to play the opening range breakouts. So you could go and set up a session to represent that opening range you're interested in. So for instance, if you wanted to play a 15-minute open range breakout, you could set up a session for that first 15 minutes. And then you could have that marked on your charts. And then you could have the session tool tell you the range, what the actual range is in the first 15 minutes. And it could mark the high line and the low line and the other things you would need to do various, open range breakout trades. So in terms of the tool, a session is nothing more than a period of time that you define. And you decide on what the meaning of that time that you've defined is. So what, in a nutshell, can the session tool do? Well, as I mentioned before, when you define a session, you can have the tool mark that on your charts. And it's going to do that by drawing a box around the candles that close within the session that you have defined. Now, you can also have hidden sessions where you have defined a session, but you tell the tool not to display it. And you can do that to have the tool collect information. Perhaps you don't want to have it display the session, but you want to have it display some lines that are based on the session. You can do things like that as well. You can also have the tool generate alerts when the price crosses, certain critical levels associated with the session. Now, the obvious ones are the high, the low, the open, the close, and the midpoint of the session. And some of those, particularly for the open range breakout traders, the high, the low, and the midpoint are going to be the ones that they're most interested in. You can also have the tool collect certain statistics about the session. And then you can use these statistics perhaps to predict possible behavior of future sessions or, for some strategies. There are various strategies that go by different names. For instance, there's the night owl strategy, sometimes called the nighthawk strategy, and there's several other names for it, where you could potentially have the session tool do some of the work for you for those strategies. But the statistics, you can have it calculate things like the range of the session, the average range over a series of multiple sessions, and you can define exactly, how many sessions should be in that range, and it's essentially a moving average. You can also have it give you the standard deviation for that. You can have it look at things like the distance from the open of the session to the high, or the open of the session to the low. And then, of course, you could have averages for those and standard deviations for those also. So those are some of the kinds of things that you can have it collect in terms of statistics. You can also have the tool project lines on the chart for reference purposes. So let's say you define a session to represent the regular trading hours on a particular market. And then you can have the session tool put a line at the top of the session, you can line at the bottom of the session, and have it project those lines out. You can have it project those out until the point where price crosses those lines. So if you do that, you can then have the tool essentially automatically showing you where the prior day's high and low was. A lot of people use that for different reasons and different strategies. And you could do that, over longer periods too. There's a series of formulas that are pre-canned formulas that you can select and have the tool put lines on the chart based on those. And some of those can display things like, the prior week's high, and low, the prior month, things like that. So basically, you can have it provide you with reference information, is really what it is, that can help you with certain strategies. And again, the goal with a lot of the tools we make is to reduce the time that you spend charting. So let's look at defining a session. There's not much to defining a session, as you can see. It's defined by specifying a starting time and an ending time. And optionally, you can give the session a name. Giving the session a name is useful if you're using it to represent something, or if you have multiple sessions being displayed on the same chart. And this way, you can give it a name, you can have the tool display the name, and then you can tell the different sessions apart more easily. Now, when you're specifying the time for the start time and the end time, there's a specific format that you have to use. Basically, you're going to put 2 digits for the hours with a colon, 2 digits for the minutes with a colon, and 2 digits for the seconds. You can specify right down to the second if you want to. Now, if the end time is less than the starting time, so for instance, let's say the end time, let's say the start time rather, is going to be 5 o'clock in the afternoon. That's going to be entered as 1700 hours. That's the way we would say it in the military. But you'd have 17 for the hours, because 5 p.m. is the 17th hour of the day. 00 for the minutes, because we're getting in, we want our session to start with the market open there. And the seconds would be 00 as well. Now, if the end time is 8:30 the following morning, you'd be entering that as 083000. Since the 8th hour of the day is less than the 17th hour, that's how the tool tells that your session wraps a calendar day and wraps to the following morning. Now, I get a bit ahead of myself, Roy, and I mentioned the available statistics, but we'll go through that again here. And again, you can turn these different statistical things on and off, so you can have it just keep track of the ones that you're actually interested in, and not have it waste time on ones you're not interested in. And you can control again which ones are displayed. So the tool can automatically calculate the range of a session. And if you wanted to, you want to go across multiple sessions, you can have it average the range of the last X number of settings, where you determine, what X is. By default, it's going to look at the last 10 sessions. And since you can calculate the average, it can also calculate the standard deviation. So you can see how much do the sessions really vary in terms of range. And you can do the same thing with the distance from the open to the high of the session, and the distance from the open to the low of the session. And you can potentially use those to attempt to project where future sessions, or I should say what the range of future sessions might be. Now, if you tell the tool to display weak statistics, it's going to display them just below the session box on the lower left side. The session box is the box that the tool draws around all of the candles that are considered to be part of the session. The label for the session will be drawn above the session box on the left side as well. And again, you can choose what statistics you actually want it to show. So you don't just, get all these things being blindly put up there. So here's the range of settings that control the display of the statistics. The first setting up here, this is your master switch for showing statistics. If this is set to true, then statistics will be displayed. If it's set to false, which is the default, then they will not be displayed. And as you can see here, looking at the setting, this is a setting that's under the control of the OSF subsystem. We've gone over that in quite some detail in prior lessons, so we're not going to get into it this much, too much in this one here. But again, the setting has to be entered in quotes, and the pound sign or the number sign, whichever name you prefer, that initiates a comment. Everything after that is considered a comment and will be ignored. So that gives you the ability to preserve existing settings so that if you want to go back to them, you still have them there. So for instance, if I was to go and put true in this setting to turn on the display of statistics, I would put the word true starting immediately after the first quote mark, and then I would put a pound sign after it. So the pound sign would then make everything after that a comment. So the existing setting of default pound sign 25 would all be considered a comment and be ignored. And then if I wanted to go back to the default setting, I could just delete the word true and the pound sign that I had put in there, and everything would be back exactly the way it was, before I initiated the change. So these are all OSF controlled settings here. Now, the next group of settings here controls the display of the range-based statistics. And we have the three statistics there we talked about: the range of the session, then the average range across multiple sessions, and then the standard deviation across, multiple sessions. And again, these are true and false. True turns it on, allows it to be seen. False turns it off, and it won't be calculated. The next block, again, it's the same, the same pattern. We have our basic measurement, which is the open to the high of the session. And then we have the average of that across multiple sessions and the standard deviation across multiple sessions. So again, you just set those you want to see to true, and they'll show up, and the others won't be calculated and won't show up. The next block, again, it's going to be 3 settings because we have 3 statistics we look at. And this is for the measurement of the open to the low of the session. Now, of course, because you're putting stuff onto the chart, we're going to give you some control over what that looks like. And these are all settings that we've seen in the prior lessons. So we're not going to spend a lot of time on them here. But you have all the usual suspects for the text. You'll be able to set the color, the transparency, the font, bold or italic. The size is a big one. There's also the offset, which allows you to move the label away from the session box and give you some more space between the text and the session box. Down here, the next two, this is setting number 43. You can see the reference numbers here for the settings. All the settings that are under OSF control have reference numbers. For some people, it's a lot easier to find the settings by the reference number than by the name. But setting 43, the average length for all of the stats, the averages and the standard deviations, those are based on a moving average. You have to specify the length of the moving average, or the period as it's sometimes called. And this is where you do that. The default for this is 10, but you can set that to what you need. And then this last one, decimal places and label. This works the same way as the same setting does in the chart tool. If you leave it on default, the tool is going to try to figure out how many decimal places to use for the values being displayed for the statistics or for anything else. And there's a couple of algorithms that are available. You can select which one you want. If you put a negative number in here, -1 is one of the automatic algorithms, -2 is the other. Or you can go in there and actually specify exactly the number of decimal places to use. So you could go in there and say use 4 decimal places. And then all of the numbers that get output will have 4 decimal places. So you've got quite a bit of control over how the stats are displayed and which stats are displayed and what it's going to look like. Now the session tool can generate alerts. And it's going to generate alerts, or you can tell it to generate alerts when one of the lines that it puts onto the chart is crossed. And you can do this on a line-by-line basis. So let's say you have the session tool marking the high of the session, and you have it putting a line there, and you want to get an alert when price crosses that line. You can set up the tool to do that. If you want to put a projection on the chart based on one of the pre-canned formulas that it has, and you want to get an alert when price reaches that, you can do that. The typical ones that a lot of people use are, again, related to the session when the session is set up for use as an open range breakout box. And there's a lot of strategies that revolve around the open range breakout box. So if you're using a 15-minute open range breakout box, which is very common, typically you would turn on the high line, the low line, and the midpoint line in the session tool. And there are, open range breakout strategies associated with each of those lines within the session. And this way you can get alerts when price crosses those lines to perhaps put some of those strategies into action. Now, I've mentioned that there are pre-canned formulas, and those are listed in Appendix C of the manual. We'll take a look at Appendix C once we're done with the slides and the, I guess you'd call this the formal presentation. But before we actually start to play with TradeStation and the session tool itself. But the formulas are listed in Appendix C. Now, line lengths are important because that's what the session tool is doing, is putting lines on your chart. And you don't want those lines to just extend forever to the right, at least not in most cases. There may well be times when you want to, but in most cases, you're going to want the line to stop at a certain point. And the session tool gives you a lot of different ways, to determine the end point for a line. So, you can do simple things like have the line end when the current session ends. You could have it extend from the current session to the start of the next one. You can do things like have the line stop when price crosses it, either going above it or below it. Or you can have it close. Price has to close above it or close below it before the line stops. You can also do things like specify that the line goes for a certain number of candles or a certain period of time. It could be seconds, it could be minutes, it could be hours or days or more. There is an entire list of all the different options you have for telling the session tool where a line should end. Those are listed in Appendix B of the manual. And again, you'll see there's quite a few different things there. A lot of them are variations on a theme. Like there's a lot that'll be time-based, but there's a lot of different ways to do it there. So you can choose the one that's most appropriate for whatever it is you're trying to do. Now, projections. This is a projection is simply a line that is put on the chart based on one of the pre-canned formulas that we have in Appendix C. And a lot of those formulas involve the statistics that are being collected by the session tool. So a lot of the lines that end up getting put on the chart with the session tool are for reference purposes. And they're typically going to be things like, highs or lows from prior sessions, or, highs or lows from prior days or months, things of that nature. They're, again, for reference purposes. The other reason that people would put lines on the chart with the session tool is that they're attempting to project some kind of possible future market behavior. So let's say you have the session tool set up, you've defined, let's say a pit session for some market. And you're trying to get an idea of what the range of price is going to be in the next pit session. And so you have the averages of the range from the prior pit session and the standard deviations. So you could go out and have the tool calculate and put on the chart a high line and a low line of where the next session may go to. So, and you can use the standard deviation to get an idea of, how accurate that projection may be. If the standard deviation is really high, then that projection may not be that accurate. But if the standard deviation is rather tight and relatively small, then the projection for the next session may be fairly accurate, and you might be able to use that to get an edge on the market. So that's the way that projections are typically used. Now, the session tool does have full OSF support. Its support is a little bit different than what's in the chart tool, though. If you remember from the lesson on the chart tool, where we talked about OSF, the settings in the chart tool are broken up into 3 tables internally. You've got your rules table, you have your skins table, which has all your display related settings. And then you have a miscellaneous table for things that did not fit cleanly into the other 2. And each one of those tables resulted in a different type of OSF file. Well, the session tool only has 2 internal tables. It doesn't have a miscellaneous table. So it basically has a rules table and then a skins table, and that's it. So slight difference between the chart tool and the session tool. So the session tool is only going to have 2 types of OSF files associated with it: a rules OSF file and a skins OSF file. But other than that, they operate the same way. Everything operates the same way. The settings are the same, except the session tool doesn't have anything pertaining to the miscellaneous OSF file. But the settings for controlling rules and skins files are the same between them. They're handled the same way. Now, another difference between the chart tool and the session tool is the naming of the OSF files. And we'll look at this in a bit, but the names of the OSF files for the session tool include the word session in the name. That allows you to pick them out, in a directory where you have OSF files for both the chart tool and the session tool. But because the file names are different, it allows the OSF files for the session tool and the chart tool to coexist in the same directory. So again, we'll take a look at a directory that has both of them when we get done with the slides here. Now, in the settings for the session tool, after you have the settings for defining the session and the settings governing the statistics, then you have settings for lines, settings for the high line, the low line, the midpoint, the open, close. And those settings are essentially all the same. They just have a slight change in the name to make them distinct. And so you know that which line those settings are applying to. So here we have the settings for the high line of this session. Again, the other lines related to the session, the open, the close, the midpoint, the low, they all have the same settings, except instead of saying high in the setting, it'll have, let's say low, if it's for the low line. You'd have midpoint for the midline, open, close, whatever. But again, it's going to be the same number of settings. The only difference is going to be, again, the high is replaced with, whatever the name of the particular line that those settings are for. And so if we look at the settings, the very first setting here is your master switch for that line. So in this case, display session high. If that's true, the tool is going to draw a line for the session high. If it's false, there won't be any such line. Now, if that's turned off, if that's false, all the other settings here will be ignored. So if display session high is true, then all these other settings are active. And we can break these settings up into some groups here. So we have two settings here which control the length of the high line. And again, Appendix B of the manual has all of those. We'll go look at the different ones there. But essentially, you'll be picking which method you want to end the line. And some of those methods you have input to control what they're doing. That input would be the length factor. In this case, the high line length factor. After that, we have a block of settings to control what the line looks like. These, again, are the usual suspects. We've seen these in the prior lessons. They're all pretty much the same. The type of the line, the thickness, the color, the transparency. Here you have the alert option, which, again, if true, will cause the tool to generate an alert whenever price crosses the high line. That's the case in our example. Now, the lines can have labels, and the next switch controls whether the label is there or not. And then you can put in user text. So you can put in whatever you want there for text. You can also add a date and timestamp as well. And you can determine whether that date and timestamp should come before the user text that you put in here or after it. You will also have control over the format for the date and timestamp. And again, the format's given in the manual. It's not that hard. And it allows you to extract parts of the date and timestamp. So if you do not want the entire big full-length date and timestamp, you can go and extract just the parts you want and change the actual format used. And since you're putting text onto your chart, you have all the usual suspects to control how that text looks. The color, the transparency, the font, bold, italic, the usual, just what you'd expect. And then the last two settings control the size. This is going to be the size of the font used in points. And then the last setting is in ticks. And what it does is it allows you to adjust the distance between the line and the label. So you can increase that distance if you wish for some reason. So it looks like a lot of settings, but really they're just broken up into little groups. And if you take them a group at a time, it's not that hard at all. Now for a projection is a line, but there's a little bit more to it. So we pick up a few extra settings here, but you'll see it's pretty much the same as what we just saw, except for the new settings. So again, you have your master switch that determines whether or not the projection is active. You can have up to 10 projections from a single session tool. In this particular sample, I grabbed the settings from the second projection. Like I said, you can have up to 10. And just like for the regular lines we looked at a moment ago, you have your settings that indicate how long the line should be, where the line should end essentially. But now we have the extra settings and calculation method. This is the formula from Appendix C that you want to use to create this line. And again, we'll go look at those in the manual here in a few minutes. And some of the formulas require some inputs, a multiplier and an offset. For the formulas that do, they'll tell you what values to put in for the multiplier and the offset here. Now, by default, projections are going to start from the open of the session. However, you can choose to have it project from a prior candle. So if you set from prior candle here to true, then the following setting becomes active. You have to tell it how many candles to go back before the open of the session. And that would be the starting point for the line and where the line would be calculated from. After that, we have the usual suspects to control what the line looks like, just like we saw previously. You have an alert capability, so you can tell the session tool to notify you if price crosses this projected line. And you can label it. And again, you can control the text that's used to label it. Now, one thing I'll say about the text, whatever you put in here for the text, that will show up. You can have the date and time added to it, either put before it or after it. But then you'll have the price level for the line will be appended to all of that. So if you put nothing there for the custom label text, then you just get the price that corresponds to that line. So we have the same controls we had before for adding a date and timestamp. We have our controls for adjusting the appearance of the label, color, transparency, font, all that kind of stuff. And then at the very end, just like before, we have controls for the size and position of the label. And again, the size is going to be the size of the font in points. And the offset is going to be in ticks. And that, again, allows us to move the label away from the line. So anybody have any questions about this? All right, so let's go look at the appendices in the manual, because we want to be able to get a grasp of the different ways of ending a line and of the different formulas that are available. So this is the manual for the beta. Everybody should have a copy of that. It is up on the server. And we can see down here in the appendices, Appendix B has the different line length modes. Appendix C is the line calculation methods. These are the pre-canned formulas for doing projections. And Appendix D has the information you need if you wish to add a date or timestamp to a label and to get it to format the way you want it to. So we'll go look at the line length modes. So there's quite a few different methods for ending a line here. And they've all been given numbers. So we got 24 of them. Some of these are pretty simple. You know, method 0, the line ends with the end of the current session. So if you're only interested in, let's say, price when it crosses the high line, but only if it happens during the session you've defined, then you may want the high line to end with the session since you're not interested in it after the session's over. And that way it doesn't clutter up your chart. There's a lot of the times where you may want the line to go to the start of the next session. And that would be method number 1. These are probably the two most common ones that are used. If you want the line to extend to the right indefinitely, you can do that as well, of course. Now, here's some of the more useful ones where you can have a line end when price crosses it. And you can get specific enough to where you can say that price has to close after crossing the line. You know, so method number 3 here, you know, the line's going to extend to the right until price goes above it. So you might use this with a session high. If we've defined our session to be regular, you know, the entire regular trading hours, then this will be the high, or the line that's on the chart will represent the high of the regular trading hours. That line would extend to the right until price goes above it. And with method number 3, price just has to wick above it for the line to end. With method number 4, the line won't end until price actually closes above it. And of course, since we're looking at things closing above lines, we'll also be looking at things closing below lines. And that's what the next two, you know, methods do. Here you can see on method number 7, we're talking about having the line extend for a certain number of candles. And, you know, there's a whole bunch of different, you know, combinations of these things. You can call them variations on a theme. You know, if you look here, you'll see some where here, method number 10, the line can extend to the right for X number of, or Y number of seconds after the session ends. And if you can do that for seconds, of course, he's got it for minutes and hours and days and months and years as well, so that you can pick whatever is most convenient for the chart you're looking at. I mean, if you're up on a high time frame chart, you don't want to have to go down and specify things in seconds if you don't have to. So that's why you've got a lot of these different variations there. So you can pick one that makes it as easy as possible to specify what you want for the chart interval you're looking at. You know, and here we've got some others that, look for calendar breaks, essentially. Extend the line until the start of a new day or a new week. These are calendar related references. So you got a lot of different ways to specify where a line should end for lines you put on the chart. Any questions about that? Does everybody get the concept here? All right. So again, this is Appendix B of the manual. So having the manual for the chart tool is important. It's not, shall we say, the most user-friendly tool. It can do a lot of interesting things, but we had to cram that into the standard, interface for an indicator. Now, when we go to Appendix C, again, these are pre-canned formulas. Now, some of these are really simple. Oh, come on. Yeah. So some of these are really simple. Like you can have them display the monthly low. Now, to actually do that, you have to have enough data loaded for TradeStation to determine that. And this is actually a function provided by TradeStation. We're making that accessible to the user, through the session tool. So you can have them display monthly highs, monthly lows, weekly lows, daily highs and daily lows. You can also do previous opens and closes. And there's different ways that you can achieve that also. It all depends on exactly what it is you're trying to do. You could go and define a session to be, the regular trading hours, for instance, and get the high and the low of, the prior day's regular trading hours. Or you could, use some of these functions to do it as well. It's whatever is easier and whatever is more useful to you, and which gives you the results that you want. Now, as we get out of here, we start getting into actual formulas here. And here is where you start seeing some of the statistics being used. So if we look at this formula here, he is going to take the average distance from the session open to the session high, and you're going to be able to multiply that by something, and then you can add an offset to it. And if you remember in the settings, we had some extra settings. We had a setting where you specified the formula, and you had some settings which were for parameters to the formula. And that's what projection X multiplier is. That was one of the parameters. And X is the number of the projection. So if you remember, you can do 10 projections. The projections are numbered 1 through 10. And so if you're setting up projection number 2, which was our example in the slides, then this will be projection 2 multiplier and projection 2 offset in the formula. So again, in this particular case, it tells you, here you have the formula. It's going to be y times the projection multiplier plus the projection offset plus your starting point where you're projecting from. And that's going to be, by default, the open of the session. So using this, when the new session starts, you can immediately have the tool project where the high of the session might be based on the average of the distance from the open to the high. And of course, there's a corresponding formula that comes later for dealing with the open to the low. So going in the other direction. And so as you look at these, you can see that there are variations on a theme again. One, you're using the average. Another, you're doing things with the standard deviation. Sometimes you're doing it with the range as opposed to the distance from the open to the high or the distance from the open to the low. But this next group, again, there are variations on a theme. And again, you can pick the one that is the most appropriate for what you're trying to model. And a lot of these have come from user requests based on things that users were trying to do. So here we have some search type. These aren't really formulas, but call them pre-canned routines that you can select, where you can have them pick, the highest high or the highest low from some period of time. And then you can set how long ago that period of time was. And then work from there. And again, it really depends on what you're doing as to whether or not this is useful. These are targeted at different kinds of strategies that our users have employed in the past. And here we have others that do different things, like here you can calculate traders' floor pivots based off of session values. So there's a lot of different formulas here, and it really depends on what you're doing as to which of these formulas may be potentially useful. And if you have other formulas you'd like to see edited, please let us know. At some point, we'd actually like to change the interface and give you the ability to just put in the formula itself as a text string. But we're not there yet. And so Appendix D, this gives you the codes to use to extract different parts of the date and time stamp. So you can put those into a string. You can make a string of these codes to pull out the values that you want. And you can add additional characters to separate them, you know, or make it look like what you want. And then that date and timestamp can be added to your label for a session or for one of the lines generated by the session. You know, so there's some examples here that you can go through if you, again, have any questions or you want to play with it and try things. You can start with these. So are there any questions about this before we actually start trying to play with the tool? Okay. Again, with the session tool, the manual is your friend. Because like I said, it's not the most user-friendly tool, but it can do a lot of things. And depending upon what you're trying to do with your trading plan and your trading style, it can simplify things and make it easier for you.
Are we ready to take a break for the video?
All right, if you wish.